Have you ever wondered how games change around the world? There are so many countries out there, but we only really ever hear about the US and Japan. So today, we're going to take a trip around the world in 80 games and pick out one game per country. Oh, and also, I'll be giving priority to retro games over new ones whenever possible. And I've also brought a few guests with me, so let's get started. Argentina has recently been making improvements in its gaming scene with a slew of smaller indie games, though the game that you might be most familiar with is another Metroid 2 remake, also known as AM2R, a remake of Metroid 2 for the Game Boy that is so good that many people consider it better than the official Metroid 2 remake that we got for the 3DS. But I don't want to make a fan game my pick for Argentina. Rather, my pick is actually Mazes of Fate for the Game Boy Advance. This is a first-person dungeon crawling RPG that is clearly inspired by Eye of the Beholder, except in this game, you start out with only one character and need to fill up your party as you progress through the story. Not only that, but your party members are not fixed, as they'll change depending on your needs or what the story dictates. You have 3 classes to choose from, but you'll often talk to teachers from whom you can learn new abilities that may or may not be class related. So you can be a wizard who dabbles in rogue skills, or a warrior who learns persuasion skills. Other than that, yeah, you go around the various cities in the world map, accept quests and side quests, and go to the various dungeons defeating monsters and clearing puzzles with the combat being in real time. I also have to admit that I really like the art style here. The game was also brought over to the Nintendo DS, but from what I hear, the GBA is the way to go here, so check it out!
My name is Modern Vintage Gamer aka MVG, and for Australia I'm picking The Way of the Exploding Fist on the Commodore 64. It was a very early fighting game that really introduced me into the genre. This was way before games such as Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2 of course. But Fist, as I'll call it from now on, was developed by Greg Barnett, and he was an absolute genius developer that really introduced so many unique and interesting things to the fighting game genre, even though these days we just take for granted. For example, Way of the Exploding Fist featured multiple stages with multiple hand-drawn backgrounds, and all of them looked absolutely gorgeous, I might add. There was also a challenge stage where you would have to take on a bull and try to defeat that without getting, just completely impaled by the bull's horns. But there was also a challenge system where you would start as a novice and then you would work your way through the ranks to get to the ultimate, which was 10th Dan. And if you are someone that is familiar with karate, you will know that getting your dans is something that is a big prestige and honor. So getting to 10th Dan in this game was certainly no joke. But not only this, there was a very unique and interesting point scoring system where you could either connect a blow to your opponent with a clean blow, and that would offer you, or that would reward you with a full point, which was 2 parts of a yin-yang or a complete yin-yang. And if you connected a little bit off, you would get half a point. And the way that the winner was determined was the first opponent that got to 2 complete yin-yangs would then beat the round and then move on to the next round. And of course, if you were defeated by your opponent, then you would have to continue. But the game also featured 2-player mode, so you could fight with yourself and your friend, obviously locally back in those days. But the cool part about the scoring system, the yin-yang scoring system, was that Greg Barnett even developed a very early hitbox detection system to determine if a point was clean or if it was a half point. And this is something that we saw in 1985, many years ago, many years way before games such as Street Fighter as mentioned. There's all these bone-crunching sounds when you either land a blow and take down your opponent, or if an opponent lands a blow on you. So overall, even though there are many awesome games that did come out from the country of Australia, Way of the Exploding Fist for me is my biggest standout and definitely my pick of the bunch.
Austria is the country that gave us Ori and the Blind Forest series of indie games. But 25 years before that, Austria was a home to many Amiga games, whose genres range from strategy and RPG to adventure. But my pick for Austria is Whale's Voyage for the Amiga, MS-DOS, and Amiga CD32. This game is a unique mix of space exploration where you have to travel around the various planets, buy items at a low price to sell them at the highest bidder, with a first-person sci-fi RPG. And as far as I know, this is the only game that mixes these two genres in such a unique and interesting way. The uniqueness begins right at the character creation, where instead of selecting a class for each of your crew members, you need to instead select their biological parents and what sort of education they received, which can range from preppy schools to being raised as an orphan in the slums. Add some RNG into it and these will dictate what sort of character you get, which can range from soldier and bounty hunter to a medic, psychic, and many more. From there on, you have to take on quests, make money, buy and sell merchandise, engage in ground combat, or be raided by space pirates mid-travel. Also, the fact that this game was made in Austria means a lot of the characters kinda sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Hello merchants, let us see what you can offer.
Which definitely lends to this game's uniqueness. And if you have the CD version or the Amiga CD32 version, you also have a glorious intro theme song that sounds like it came straight out of a European 90s nightclub. So I say, check it out if you can. Brazil is a country with one of the most unique gaming histories in the world, a lot of which is tied to Sega. So for example, I could mention the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive port of Duke Nukem 3D, or the Master System port of Street Fighter 2, or really any game made or modified by Tectoy, who was Sega's Brazilian distribution partner at the time. On the other hand, Brazil has a vibrant homebrew scene for the Mega Drive, creating ports of popular games to Sega's 16-bit system to this day. And you also have traditional indie games like Chroma Squad or Brutal Doom, as well as very interesting online projects like Poketibia, which modifies the popular MMO Tibia, mixing it with Pokemon. But for my pick for Brazil, I have to go with Oniken by Joy Masher. An excellent 2D side-scrolling platformer modeled after the NES games of old. The game by itself is excellent, but I picked it because of what it represents for Brazil, and that is how the country was starting to become a noticeable player within the gaming industry. Because not only did Oniken receive good reviews from mainstream gaming media, but it also paved the way for Joy Masher's follow-up games, which in my opinion are even better than Oniken. Games like Odalus, the Contra-hardcore-inspired Blazing Chrome, and the recently released Vengeful Guardian Moonrider. Any game by this studio is a love letter to classic games of old, but I pick Oniken because it was their first release and it paved the way for greater things to come.
I'm Hungry Guria, and for Canada, I've chosen to talk about Eternal Darkness for the GameCube. The events of the game revolve around a young woman named Alexandra. The story opens with her arriving at her grandfather's mansion to investigate his death, since the circumstances around his passing are peculiar to say the least. After beginning to explore the house for clues and diving into his writings, the player gets catapulted between her experiences there and those of many other ordinary people across time that are connected to the goings-on. At first glance, the gameplay action might come off as a bit generic. Each person you play as can wield weapons and magic, and will have to scour their environments looking for ways to solve puzzles to keep moving through the story's many twists and turns. With that said though, there are a couple of aspects that really elevate the experience to something beyond a typical third-person perspective action puzzle game. The biggest one is the sanity meter. As characters are confronted by monsters and forced to fight for their lives, this meter ticks ever downward. and once it crosses certain thresholds, the lines of what's real and what's not become blurred, leading to a very unique flavor of horror that keeps the suspense high. Your character may start seeing things that aren't even there, or hearing whispers or other noises that heighten the fear factor. The game doesn't hold back from taking things beyond the fourth wall from time to time as well, making for some serious moments of panic and worry before I realized the game was pulling a fast one on me. I love how this dark style created a real sense of curiosity. Even though my gut instincts were screaming at me to run in the other direction most of the time, I just had to see what new awful thing was behind a locked door I'd finally found a key for, who was on the phone when it rang, or what was down in the basement. These careful moments of discovery were contrasted against some high-risk action segments where I got to beat up monsters and do my best to avoid getting sliced up myself. The mixture of gameplay modes was a perfect balance of these two extremes, with the faster-paced parts being a welcome reprieve from the fever-pitch suspense levels during the exploratory ones. As someone who doesn't necessarily love gore and guts in my horror game experiences, Eternal Darkness was an ideal way to get the hairs on the back of my neck standing up without also needing to hide under the covers all night after I was done playing it. I had to venture outside of my comfort zone for this playthrough, but it's a one-of-a-kind experience that I'm glad I had.
When people think of games made in China, they used to think of bootleg systems and games of dubious quality. Though, if I'm being honest, some of them were actually pretty good and did not get the respect they deserved. But over these last few years, China completely reinvented itself, with the release of MMO-style games like Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail. So instead, I want to talk about a period of gaming history in China that always gets overlooked, and that's the late 90s to early 2000s, back when we were getting a lot of great Chinese games in the West that often went overlooked, and we didn't even know that they were made in China in the first place. We have, for example, any game made by Trevor Chan, whose Hong Kong-based studio Enlight Software made excellent strategy games for PC like Capitalism and Capitalism 2, a series of games where you begin with a smaller business and need to expand to every conceivable industry like supermarkets, transportation, or research and development, as well as the Seven Kingdoms series, a series of 4X strategy games which received critical praise back in the day and were cult hits in their own right, due to the impressive diplomacy, espionage, and country management options that you would expect out of a Civilization game, except that it was all in real time. But if strategy isn't your thing, or if you prefer a game from mainland China, then how about a Metal Slug clone for the Nintendo DS by the name of Commando Steel Disaster? Yes, once again proving that SNK had a stranglehold in the Asian arcade market, we see a game that is a clear love letter to the popular run-and-gun game. Unfortunately, as mentioned before, Chinese game releases during this time tended to fly under the radar, and so this game is somewhat rare for the system. But whether you're a PC strategy fan or an SNK fan, I'm breaking the rules for China and picking two games instead of one for Hong Kong and one for mainland China. Croatia is a country responsible for several modern major releases like Starpoint Gemini and the Talos Principle, both of which would be more than deserving to represent their home country. But as all Croatians know, if you're going to pick just one game to represent Croatia, that choice is obvious.
Sam I Am.
This is Serious Sam, Croatia's flagship series, a first-person shooter which became infamous for the high number of enemies on screen and the variety of enemy type combinations you would have to fend off at any given moment, all while giving you the style of gameplay and humor that was clearly inspired by games like Duke Nukem 3D.
Listen to what our numerous beta testers have to say about the game.
I lost 4 in 1/2 pound, and now I can see my business again.
Wow!
Serious Sam HD is way better than a loveless marriage.
Hang in there, Mom.
And make no mistake, crowd control is the name of the game here, because you'll be fighting so many enemies and enemy types on screen all at once. Yes, Serious Sam is the Croatian Duke Nukem, and this series' success can be felt with how many entries it got, including 4 main games, HD remasters, a VR remake, and even 2D side-scrollers. Serious Sam is the series that put Croatia on the gaming map, and it's still worth checking out to this day.
Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian, and my pick for the game to represent Denmark may come as a slight surprise to you, given that it's not Hitman Codename 47, although that is indeed a Danish game and arguably our most well-known export on the video game front. But no, my pick is actually this guy, Hugo, or Hugo as he's known around here. Imagine, if you will, it's 1991, and you're sitting with your family in the living room watching television, because back then people actually watched television. There's a late-night talk show on one of the channels, but you're not there to watch the guests prattle on with the hosts. No, you're waiting for that special moment to come on. And finally, it does. The hosts announce that the phone lines are now open, and people start calling in, not to talk with the hosts, but to play a computer game, live on national TV, using their touch-tone landline phones as the controller. The game is fairly straightforward. You've got 3 levels. The game is basically a runner where this bobble-headed little turd just takes off on his own, and you have to dodge oncoming obstacles by pressing directional keys. Easier said than done though, because remember, people were using their touch-toned landline phones to control the guy, which had a fair amount of input lag. And this first level just goes on for frickin' ever. If they were lucky enough to find their way out of the maze, they'd go on to the bridge stage. Now, instead of dodging shit by going left and right, this stage introduces a jumping mechanic where you have to leap over these holes in the bridge. Although shorter than the preceding mine level, this bridge level did represent a sharp difficulty spike where Hugo falling to a splattery death Wile E. Coyote style was a fairly common occurrence. But if by some wildly improbable fortuitous miracle they happen to cross the bridge, players would then be treated to level 3, which is just a single screen where they pick a door at random. One of the doors has this bearded twat behind it, he pulls a lever, and it's instant game over. Sucks to be you. The other 2 contain either gold or an improbably large gemstone, which in the broadcast television version would translate into some sort of monetary prize for the caller who made it this far. Now, Hugo was a primetime hit for Danish TV in the early 90s. He debuted in September of 1991 and remained a mainstay on the air until the show he was on finally called it quits in 1996. While it's fair to say that Hugo had a huge hand in legitimizing the world of computer games in the national mainstream, he wasn't the first call-in computer game to air on TV. His predecessor, a bluish polar bear of sorts by the name of Oswald, debuted on the same late-night talk show in 1989, 2 years before Hugo reared his misshapen head, and was a fairly big success too. The guys who made Oswald were members of the Danish demo scene. They were basically just a bunch of fresh-faced teenagers who were contracted by this guy, Ivan Sölvason, who had made a deal with the production company that was making the talk show to make a game for them, but he didn't have a clue on how to actually make games. Now, the touch-tone phone controller that these kids came up with was a pretty novel idea at the time, and it's frankly amazing that it worked as well as it did. The game ran on an Amiga 2000 in the studio, and it was hooked up to a modem that could translate the caller's phone input into directional signals for the game to understand. The modem had to be switched on at just the right time, just before the actual game would start, because it had this terrible tendency to overheat and basically kill the game stone dead if it was left on for too long. But Ivan is a bit of a contentious figure, however. By most accounts, he's a bit of a paranoid narcissist, and not a terribly good businessman to boot. When Oswald became a hit on Danish TV, the demo scene guys who actually made the game tried to renegotiate their contract, only to find out there was no proper contract to renegotiate. Despite that, a few of them stuck around to help Ivan make the proposed follow-up to Oswald that would eventually turn into Hugo, but to no one's surprise, they were swindled out of any compensation for that once again. Finally fed up with Ivan's bullshit, the team left to strike out on their own, which after a few false starts actually turned out rather well for them. They eventually went on to form a little company called IO Interactive and released, well, you guessed it, Hitman Codename 47. Meanwhile, Ivan still goes around telling everyone he was the victim in all of this because the idea of paying someone for their work is really just a massive nuisance when you just want to take all the credit and prestige for yourself. He did get a very lucrative deal out of Hugo though, and he managed to license it into worldwide distribution, and that's how Hugo ended up on various global TV shows, and why I'm talking about it right now. I'm the Space Quest Historian. My big thanks to my friend and towel-wearing game archivist extraordinaire Alan Christofferson for his help with facts and research for this bit, and until next time, I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Bye!
Estonia is the country that recently began turning heads with the release of Disco Elysium, a modern game that has become a runaway hit due to its inventive approach to storytelling and how stats can affect the progression of a game's plot. But there was a game that preceded Disco Elysium by almost 30 years, one that is near and dear to MS-DOS gamers everywhere, and most never even knew where it came from. This is Skyroads, a sort of racing game, platformer, and challenge room hybrid in which you pick from 30 tracks available and need to jump across platforms, avoid pitfalls and traps, all while playing under some truly psychedelic visuals. Don't think this game is easy though, because not only are you not given much time to react, but the shifting perspective makes it hard to accurately assess where you need to jump to. But it's those same 3D visuals that help Skyroads stand out. After all, this game came out the same year as Star Fox for the Super Nintendo, and it helped cement the notion that 3D polygons were here to stay.
Hello, I'm Matthias. I play games, I even like some of them. And I'm here to represent Finland. Finland's game history goes a long way, from technical feats on the Commodore to mobile games of mass success. But today I'm going to focus on one of my favorite Finnish games and how a Finnish developer, Remedy, refined the third-person shooter genre with Max Payne in 2001.
The game tells the tragic tale of an NYPD officer, Max Payne, whose wife and newborn child are murdered in his home. This bums Max out a little bit, so he decides to go and try to hash things out. Max Payne has a message to deliver with bullet points to share. The gunplay is so satisfying and the controls are excellent, even if Max's footwork can feel a bit stiff. Aiming and shooting feel instantaneous and glue you right into the action. Guns feel just right, especially the shotguns, and you always feel the right kind of overpowered. You can't waltz in brainlessly, but enemies drop like flies when you get in the groove, and encounters usually last like 5 seconds. Or if you're in a bigger hurry. Max Payne is most remembered for its use of bullet time, which slows down time but lets the player act slightly faster than his surroundings. This is useful for checking corners and dealing with bigger enemy groups. You find yourself using this all the time, and at the time of the Matrix movies, this sure got people's attention. Max Payne wasn't the first to implement bullet time, but was the first to execute it so well. The game is also full of nice little touches, like all the things in the environment to interact with, and how something interesting may happen if you don't reveal yourself to enemies right away.
Red, blue, or green? It's always red or blue in the movies. So, green? No, not the green. Oh!
There are some gripes, however, and the biggest one is how Max's somewhat rough movement doesn't mix well with these parts that require tight jumps or balancing on narrow geometry, and of course falling means certain death. Just when you get used to sending perpetrators back to their god, the game throws twists at you with these dream sequences where Max Payne has to relive his painful memories and try to ignore the voices telling him he's a Punisher knockoff. The game tells a tragic tale and has its serious moments, but it doesn't take itself too seriously with its quippy noir dialogue and how people in the voiced comic panels look like they had so much fun posing for the pictures. Yeah, these comic panels are made from actual photos, and the guy playing Max Payne is the game's writer, Sami Järvi, who you may know as Sam Lake. They also used his face for Max Payne's in-game model. Just look at that iconic smirk. There's always that right kind of playfulness, as you'd expect from a game called Max Payne. Despite the occasional jank, Max Payne is sure to give you a good time if you ever wanted to play an action movie like John Wick or The Matrix. Max Payne is a Finnish gem you should definitely check out, and the sequels while you're at it, because revenge is just that sweet.
France. Now this is a tough one. France holds more weight in the gaming industry than most people seem to realize. On one hand, I could mention the cinematic platformer masterpieces by Eric Chahi and Delphine Software like Flashback and Another World. Or maybe I should pick Infogrames' seminal Alone in the Dark series, which were responsible for creating the survival horror genre as we know it today. And of course, who can forget the Rayman series, which is still going strong to this day. But no, rather than a game, I want to pick a movement known as the French Touch. Back in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, French video games had made a name for themselves, a name for being different. They often had weird and unique visual aesthetics that felt more at home on the PC-98 than a Sega or Nintendo. And they were known for their unique approach to storytelling, often broaching mature story beats and scenes that felt ahead of their time, if often a little clumsy. The games were often weird, experimental, oddly designed, and with an art style that was both beautiful and bizarre at the same time. From the Bat games to Captain Blood and the previously mentioned Another World, a French game was not something you could easily define. It was one of those cases where you know it when you see one. And so my pick for France goes to a game that forever changed my taste and view in video games. Dune, a mix of point-and-click adventure and grand strategy games, the likes of which we've never seen before or since. But really, pick any game from the French Touch movement and you'll quickly learn to appreciate this lost art in video games.
Hey, I'm John representing Germany, and when considering well-known games developed here in Germany, the first one you might think of is something like, say, Turrican, which showcased the true potential of the Amiga platform. But then there's other stuff such as The Settlers, a series which has persisted since the early 90s and remains popular to this day. But the more I thought about it, the more I kept coming back to one game, the classic PC melting experience, Crysis. Perhaps more than any other game in German history, Crysis became a phenomenon around the world. It was known for pushing cutting-edge technology, sure, but the underlying game is equally innovative at a time when shooters were increasingly going for that linear, scripted gameplay. Crysis is all about presenting players with options. Each map is large and packed with objectives to explore and unravel. You're granted full freedom in how you approach these objectives as well. This freedom is augmented directly by the nanosuit. You can, for instance, take a stealthy approach, quietly eliminating foes as you progress through the level, or you could go in loud, using your armor mode while destroying everything in your path. This autonomy and need to think on your feet makes for a rewarding experience that offers a perfect blend of open-endedness with skillful design. It was also an exceptionally interactive game. Crysis allows players to pick up just about anything, including enemies, chickens, and other objects scattered about, and all of it's governed by an advanced physics simulation. Toss an explosive device into a shack, for instance, and marvel as it breaks apart before your eyes. This level of simulation, of action and reaction, remains uncommon to this day, with most games opting for eye candy over deep physics simulation. Yet despite this, Crysis also manages to push visual boundaries. It was released in 2007 as a PC exclusive and designed to push then modern hardware to its absolute limits. Ray-marched volumetrics, parallax occlusion mapping, introduction of screen space ambient occlusion, something we'd never seen before, water caustics, per pixel motion blur, not to mention superb character rendering. It's all here, complete with ultra-dense forests that even react to weapons fire. While it does aim for realism, I maintain that Crysis equally presents a gorgeously realized artistic vision in a way that Crytek's prior game, Far Cry, simply did not. It's a stylistic and technical achievement. The people and technology behind the game wouldn't even stop after this one, and I maintain that Crysis would go on to influence the future of graphics technology in general. It is a supremely important game and one of the most recognizable PC games in gaming history. Crysis is a true German classic.
Hungary is a country that you often do not associate with video games, but dig a little deeper and you might be surprised at what you'll find. This is a country responsible for Contra Legacy of War on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, Echo the Dolphin 1 and 2 on the Mega Drive, and even Crisis Warhead, the expansion pack to Germany's Crisis. And one common name you'll find with most of these games is the studio Appaloosa Interactive, formerly known as Novo Trade International. This is the same studio who made the terrible Amiga port of Castlevania. But as the studio grew and expanded to the United States, it gained more prominence, often working with Sega and Konami as an outside studio. Of course, with the expansion to the United States, it can be hard to track which team made which games, and so my pick for Hungary is 3 Dirty Dwarfs for the Sega Saturn. A 2D beat-em-up made by the Hungarian team, which made great use of the Saturn's hardware, in which you play as 3 dwarfs from a parallel universe who are somehow connected to some children's D&D game. And as you travel to our world, you unwittingly bring an army of orcs with you. So now, armed with sporting goods equipment, it's your job to defeat the orcs and save the children. The game makes a bit of a bad first impression at first, and that's because it does not play like your typical side-scrolling beat-em-up. For one thing, there is no health bar. Each dwarf can only be hit once before they go down, and you need to hit them again to revive them to bring them back to your party. You can also change between dwarfs on the fly, each with slightly different gameplay styles over the other. But perhaps the best part about 3 Dirty Dwarfs are the boss fights. Like this one where you fight against the gym. Not the people inside the gym, but the actual gym building, which jumps around with giant feet. Or this boss fight, where you need to control the jumping character and the bed on the bottom at the same time. This game is definitely great and worth checking out. This is Coffee Talk, and it's my pick for Indonesia. Coffee Talk is a visual novel set in an alternate reality Seattle inhabited by fantasy creatures including orcs, elves, vampires, demons, and of course, the greatest fantasy creature of them all, people from Seattle. You play as a barista in an all-night coffee shop, and your job is simply to prepare drinks for your customers as you listen to their stories. The game is clearly inspired by the popular indie game Valhalla, which had a similar premise, though I feel Coffee Talk does something really well, and that's giving you a sense of belonging, a sense that in a world set in 2020, with newspapers announcing an upcoming disease that is sweeping nations, all while societal and economical tensions are at an all-time high, it gives you a place where you can be with friends and listen to their stories which reflect our own real world, with many of the intertwining plot lines subtly and not so subtly reflecting the real-life struggles that so many of us face. Sadly, this would also be the last game by its creator Mohamed Fahmy, as he passed only 2 years after releasing this game. Coffee Talk would also get a sequel simply called Coffee Talk Episode 2, which I've yet to play. But if it has the same heart, beautiful art style, soundtrack, and sense of belonging as the first game, then it's a game that will make its home country of Indonesia proud. Possibly the best part about making this video is discovering games and learning information about countries you never even considered before. This is the case with the Babylonian Twins, a game made in Iraq for the Amiga in 1993 and 1994 by 3 college students, which unfortunately was never completed because the trio could not find a publisher for obvious reasons. In this game, you play as twin princes who were thrown in jail by a sorcerer trying to usurp the kingdom. So now, you need to escape the prison and reclaim your throne. You do this by jumping and collecting items, but you also have a Sonic the Hedgehog-inspired spin dash maneuver, which can be used to increase your speed and open walls to further explore the levels. It's kind of funny too, because the way the spin dash maneuver is used, it inadvertently starts going into Metroid Shine Spark territory. But as the title suggests, in this game you play as twins. So on the first level, you start out alone and you have to rescue your brother. When you rescue him, you can change between both characters at any time, and you can jump on top of each other to reach higher platforms, giving it some minor puzzle platforming elements to the game. The game would eventually be remade and completed for iOS devices, but sadly, I feel this version loses quite a bit of its charm. The developers did promise they were going to finish the Amiga version one day, so hopefully we'll one day get to see that version instead.
My name is Goti_, and for Italy I picked Diabolic. It's a computer game for DOS and Amiga systems, but it is also a popular Italian comic from the 60s, which is still ongoing. It's about a ruthless criminal who just goes on big heists with his lover in crime. The two are not shy to the occasional murder of an innocent, so you understand how this became a sensation around here. The other big reason why I picked this game is the way it was sold by Simulmondo, the developer. This was in fact the first in an ill-fated series of licensed games that they would sell in newsstands. So, next to your crossword puzzles and magazines, in the comic section, you would find these games bundled with the actual release of the comic. And that's where the catch is. You would be getting one part of the game, while the developers were slaving away at the next issue, the next installment, which would have to come out the next month. Diabolic came out in 12 episodes, but thankfully those were, for the most part, self-contained. You could consider them separate video games even, especially with the way they kept evolving the engine and the mechanics. The game, or games, they have several great moments, however, given the budget and rushed nature of the game, the quality is questionable. The first episodes will have you rage at the screen due to the platforming. It was designed and programmed in the most brutal way, so it takes a lot of patience to figure out where you're supposed to stand and what you're even supposed to press. Otherwise, the quality of the presentation is very good. Many different artworks are present, although some of them are digitized scans and some others are original pixel art ones, which creates a clash of style. The same clash, this time good, occurs in the gameplay. In between episodes, the game will switch from an action platformer to a heist simulator, to a stealth one, and all the way up to an investigative thriller in the final episode. Simulmondo was the only big name in Italy as far as video games went in the early 90s, and all that you need to know now is that it was ran by an ambitious visionary named Francesco Carla, who looked like this. The newsstands sale model, despite being adopted by other companies, turned out to be a failure. And ultimately, what doomed the company was Carla's obsession with persevering on that same model, while the world around it was just evolving. Overworked and unpaid developers also did not help.
Hey, I'm Jimmy Hoppa representing Japan, and as for an ambassador game to represent the country's contributions to video games, well, that's a tough one, given its deep roots in gaming history and the insane amount of influential games produced in the land of the rising sun. I could go with Namco's revolutionary Pac-Man, which set arcades ablaze all over the world in the early 80s, becoming an icon not just in gaming, but of an entire decade. One might consider bestowing the honor to NX's Dragon Quest, the massively popular Famicom title that provided the spark to the RPG boom period in Japan that paved the way for so many of the genre's most beloved games and franchises that are still around today. The DNA of Capcom's Street Fighter II and Sega's Virtua Fighter are found in almost every fighting game that followed, and are both massively important titles. 32-bit era offerings such as Konami's Metal Gear Solid and Squaresoft's Final Fantasy VII changed the direction of gaming forever with their cinematic approaches to storytelling, and either would be great candidates. However, my choice is something else. No, not that piece of sewage. Yeah, it's pretty boring, I know, but it's hard to deny the impact the original 1985 Super Mario Bros. By Nintendo had on video games and the world. The mainstream appeal and just overall high quality of this game changed and shaped the industry going forward, and its impact is still felt to this very day. Nintendo had been around for a long time before Super Mario, almost a century actually, and they found success with cards, toys, and even other video game products, such as the massive arcade hit Donkey Kong in 1981, and even the original Mario Bros. From '83. However, nothing else achieved quite the level of success as Super Mario Bros. It made the Italian name Mario a household name in Japan, and the distinctly Japanese Nintendo a household name everywhere else. For the past few years, Mario has basically been an official Japanese ambassador to the world, used to promote the 2020/2021 Tokyo Olympic Games, and greeting visitors at international airports around the country. Even the classic 8-bit Mario sprite is recognized by younger gamers, since the classic SMB is one of the most re-released games ever. I don't really need to go into much more, as we all know the stories. We've all heard how Super Mario saved video games in America, all that, which is a testament to the game's legacy, and why I think it's the perfect title to represent Japan's contributions to video games. Without it, our hobby would most likely look a lot different today, and not in a positive way. So, God bless Shigeru Miyamoto.
Malaysia has a bit of a surprising entry with Ghoul Patrol for the Super Nintendo. This is the sequel to the popular Zombies Ate My Neighbors, and though Ghoul Patrol was not originally envisioned as a sequel, that's what ended up becoming. But at the time, LucasArts was preoccupied with other projects, and so development was outsourced to a Malaysian game studio, Motion Pixel, whom as far as I can tell only ever worked on this game. And while it's true that LucasArts still had a hand in co-developing this game, from a graphical standpoint, they did a phenomenal job. The pixel art style and animations are some of the best I've ever seen on the 16-bit generation, and the game retains the sandbox-like feel gameplay of its predecessor. The story is that you and your friend went to a ghost exhibit and unwittingly released a powerful entity from its seal. Now, you have to go around the various levels, picking up weapons and saving innocent bystanders. So you'll begin in mundane locations like houses and streets before moving on to more imaginative levels, like pirate ships and haunted castles. And the quality of the pixel art here really cannot be overstated, especially during boss fights. It's a shame we never got to see more projects from Motion Pixel, which leads me to assume that maybe this game did not sell as well as expected, or maybe LucasArts decided to keep things in-house for the foreseeable future. But regardless, I say, go play this game. From one co-developed game to another, this is Rage of the Dragons, a fighting game for the Neo Geo which originally began development as a Double Dragon spin-off. But the various parties were unable to secure the rights to it, so the Double Dragon content was mostly scrapped. But yeah, this is a Mexican-Japanese co-production for the Neo Geo! How cool is that? Despite not being an official Double Dragon game, you can still feel its influence as you play it, with Bimmy and Jimmy as the two main characters and even a boss fight against a Bobo, or, you know, someone similar to, but legally distinct from a Bobo. And similarly to what you see in 2D fighting games of this era, you can select a second character to serve as your partner, whom you can trade places with at any time. But yeah, even though the game came fairly late into the 2D fighting game scene, this is still a great game with awesome character designs, cool combos, and special moves. And personally, I just love juggling my foes when executing combos. Check it out if you can.
What's a notable game made in the Netherlands? Well, that's easy. It's Killzone, everyone knows that. And that's why today I'm going to talk about Jazz Jackrabbit. This Groovy Green Rabbit first came onto the scene for MS-DOS in 1994. Designed to be like mascot platformers on consoles, the story is simple. The evil Devon Shell has kidnapped your girlfriend Eva Erlong, and you have to rescue her. To do that, you run around levels at high speed, grabbing collectibles for points along the way and shooting enemies. There's a few power-ups like a force field, rapid fire, and even a hoverboard. It was enough of a success to get a sequel in 1998, Jazz Jackrabbit 2, and Christmas editions in 94 and 95. So why am I talking about Jazz Jackrabbit? You see, Cliffy B gets all the credit for creating the lethal Lagomorph, but that's not the whole story. One of the key players involved in creating the game was Arjan Brusset, a Dutch guy who developed the code for Jazz Jackrabbit while living in the Netherlands. He got his start as a demo coder for Ultraforce and wound up working for Epic as lead developer on Jazz Jackrabbit. Later, he'd go on to found Guerrilla Games, where he created Killzone. But wait, there's more. For Jazz Jackrabbit 2, he worked with Michiel van der Leeuw, another Dutch guy who worked on the engines and tools. Michiel also worked on the Killzone franchise, and has also worked on the Horizon franchise and Death Stranding. Without Jazz Jackrabbit, who knows if Killzone would have existed to put Netherlands on the game development map. Jazz Jackrabbit also happens to be a pretty amazing game. It's fast-paced, has terrific music, plays super smooth even though it's a DOS game, and even has Mode 7 effects without any of the hardware support the SNES had. It's like they took Sonic and decided to make him even cooler by giving him a gun. Wait, no, not like that.
Ronaldinho Soccer!
This is Ronaldinho Soccer for the Nintendo 64, and it is not my pick for Peru, but it is a bootleg that was created in Peru and achieved legendary meme status. But no, my actual pick for Peru is another game by the same studio, and that is Gunby F99, The Kidnapping of Lady Akiko for the Amiga. This is a game that originally began as an unofficial port of the Tana Twinbee for the Amiga, but it seems the developers gave up halfway through on the idea and instead decided to turn the game into its own thing by giving it a completely new backstory, different power-ups, and even some new game mechanics not found in the original, like juggling items onto large baskets and the need to collect crystals to see the good ending. I have a firm belief that bootlegs and unlicensed games often get an unnecessary bad rap, and Gunby F99 is a surprisingly good shmup for the Amiga, and if you want to learn more about it, you can check out my bootleg games video. But for now, let's all just agree that these games are deserving of more respect. This is Anito Defend a Land Enraged, and it's my pick for the Philippines. Anito is an RPG launched for PCs in 2003, and the game is set in the 16th century during the Spanish occupation of the Morocco island. Your father is a prominent tribe leader who strived for peace, but suddenly he mysteriously disappeared. This in turn has created tensions between the native population, the Spanish occupying forces, and the Chinese merchants to escalate, and you have to find and rescue your father before things reach a boiling point and escalate to an all-out war. The combat is in real time, and quests and dialogue trees will sometimes have multiple resolutions depending on the choices you make or skills you picked up along the way. You even have some basic cooking mechanics where you can use raw fish or meat in ovens to cook dishes to recover health faster. This is a sort of game that could only have been done in the Philippines, as it focuses on a theme that you do not often see in video games, and does it from the perspective of the native population in a nuanced way that does not feel heavy-handed. Though if you are going to play this, be prepared, as this game is fairly dialogue-heavy, even by RPG standards, and it can be quite a while before you see any real combat. This game is a unique look into a different culture that was making its first steps at telling their story through video games, and I feel it's worth looking into it for that reason alone. I think you'll be hard-pressed to find a bigger modern success story within the gaming industry than Poland, a country that, despite having the occasionally well-received game like Painkiller and Gorky 17, was not a nation that you would typically associate with gaming. But all that changed in the mid to late 2000s, with games like Bulletstorm, the Shadow Warrior Remake Trilogy, Ghost Runner, Dead Island, Cyberpunk 2020, and of course, the one trilogy that arguably began this movement, The Witcher. It really is difficult to overstate how exponential The Witcher's growth in popularity was in a short amount of time. From the first game, which garnered positive reviews and a cult following on PC despite some jank and a lower budget, to the mainstream success of its sequel on PC and the Xbox 360, which in turn led to the massive success that was The Witcher 3. And of course, we cannot forget how it also led to the creation of GOG.com. So my pick for Poland is the first Witcher game, the title that paved the way for greater things for Poland, as well as the studio behind it, CD Projekt. But is also the game that better exemplifies both Poland's and the studio's humble beginnings. It's true that we now think of CD Projekt as this massive AAA studio, but the first Witcher game was an ambitious title held back by a relatively shoestring budget, and it shows. The body and facial animations were years behind what the competition was doing, and the voice acting was often stilted or lacked proper direction, and the game was infamous for its Eurojank. But despite that, it persevered, and in many ways the first Witcher game feels like the truest one to the source material. But The Witcher would be a sign of greater things to come, and exemplifies how much the country's game development scene would grow in a short amount of time. My home country of Portugal never had much of an impact in the gaming industry, though a few games do stand out. We have, for example, the Elifoot series, an early example of football management sims that began life on the ZX Spectrum and still lasts to this day, as well as a few ZX Spectrum games like Alien Evolution. And one of Miniclips's major development studios is in Portugal, which in turn created hundreds of flash and mobile games over the years. But ask any old-school Portuguese gamer what the greatest Portuguese game ever made was, and the answer is unanimous: Paradise Cafe. This is a raunchy simulation game filled with edgy humor and not so safe for work interactions that became a phenomenon in my country. Your goal in the game is simple: get a weapon, start committing robberies, get money, get down for some fun, and avoid being arrested or robbed yourself. It's an extremely basic game that mostly lives on its novelty, and people often state that it was GTA before GTA. The funny thing is that we actually have no idea who actually made this game or who even published it. It was a game that became popular through word of mouth and piracy. And in 2019, word had even gotten out that a group of game design college students were working on a remake of the game, though this project would soon become controversial. I mean, what might have been funny for edgy teens in 1985 isn't really acceptable 35 years later. And truth be told, this is a game that most likely deserves to stay in the past, as it was never really a good game to begin with. It's just one that lived off of its edgy humor.
I'm Steven Nansens, originally from Romania, and my pick is Gibbous, a Cthulhu adventure, which, despite its age, is a love letter to the retro LucasArts adventure games era. Gibbous is an old-school, frame-by-frame animated point-and-click adventure made by an indie studio from Transylvania, of all places, and manages to straddle the line between being a tribute to the adventure games of old, while also bringing in its own character and vision to the table. The backgrounds are gorgeously illustrated 2D images featuring all manner of weird and forced perspectives with a very stylized look, much in tune with the game's inspirations. And they are all pretty much loaded with all manner of references. Let's quickly look at this one. You have, starting from left to right, Grim Fandango, Adventure Time, Lovecraft, Double Day of the Tentacle, and Edgar Allan Poe. These being situated at the beginning of the game should give you an idea of the type of experience you're embarking upon. The puzzles are very straightforward, and despite the title of the game, there is no moon logic here, folks. Progressing through Gibbous is generally a super pleasant and fluid experience, which I believe allows for you to take in the story that much better. This is one area where it diverges from its inspirations. It could have been much more difficult, and I also imagine there are some scrapped versions of puzzles that were more head-scratchy, but I am glad they chose the more straightforward approach, because I honestly don't have the type of time I had when I was playing adventure games in my youth. 20 years ago, I could spend 3 days being stuck on one Grim Fandango puzzle, and I did. Nowadays, not so much. And even so, the game still took me around 20 hours to complete because I really loved all the item descriptions and references. Each hotspot in the game has at least 3 voiced lines to it, so it's a decent time investment for the target demographic anyway, especially if you plan to take it slowly and not speedrun it, which would be kinda counter to the whole idea of adventure games, at least in my opinion. One place the devs take inspiration from the past and turn it into their own thing is their take on the uber classic by now instant sword fighting mechanic from the Monkey Island series. They modernized the idea and turned it into a rap battle. That's right, Gibbous, a Cthulhu adventure game, is the first video game, to my knowledge at least, that has a rap battle as a gameplay mechanic in it. And it is fire. There would be more to say about the game, which I do on my channel, but as it is with most adventure games, it's gonna be much better when you experience it for yourself.
Hello, my name is Victor and I'm your video game comrade from Russia. I bet you think that Russia has to be represented with Tetris. And you're totally right. Yes, Tetris is the most famous game made in Russia, but I thought that it would be boring to tell about the game you already know all over again. There are a lot of comprehensive Tetris stories on YouTube, so I decided to pick another game I'm sure all of you know about, but probably have no clue that its origin is Russia. And basically, it's not even one game, it's an entire gaming genre. And if you even didn't play it yourself, you definitely know a person who did. In 1992, Russian PC games publisher Gamos released a game named Color Lines. It was a simple yet very addictive puzzle game with the goal of lining up 5 spheres of the same color in a row to clean them from the screen. Every time you moved the sphere around the game's screen and didn't make it in a 5 spheres line, 3 new ones of random color appeared. If you aligned 5 in a row, there were no new ones on this move. You couldn't control where the new spheres will appear, but could see which colors they would be. Yes, just like in Tetris. In 1994, another Russian independent game developer Evgeny Alemzhin released an MS-DOS game named Shariki. The name simply means balls. This game was totally inspired by Color Lines, yet had slightly different gameplay, matching only 3 spheres instead of 5 on the screen already filled with spheres. In 1995, the Japanese developer Intelligent Games mixed it with the original Tetris game and released a 2-player block swap game, Panel de Pon, for Super Famicom. Not sure about copyrights here, but the Western name Tetris Attack shows that they've bought the rights for at least Tetris here. Meanwhile, Gamos sold the rights for their Color Lines to Namco in 1996, and Japanese PC gamers got an official Color Lines game for Windows, Golly Ghosts Go. Except for the name and visuals, it was the same Color Lines game. All that happened later is history, and no one of the followers would admit that the idea of the game wasn't theirs. In 2001, PopCap Games released Bejeweled. The game Entertainment Weekly declared Gone with the Wind of the casual game world. Take a look and tell me it's not a Shariki clone. In 2012, King released another bestseller game, Candy Crush Saga. Again, no, it's not a clone of the Russian game from the 90s. In the era of the smartphones, a lot of other games that looked and played almost the same were released. For instance, Rainbow Lines or Parkour Nora. Both of these are basically Color Lines. And no, Gamos or Namco have nothing to do with these ones. Jewel Quest, Hexic and other homescapes followed. So yes, Match 3 games were technically invented in the 90s in Russia by 2 developers. Gamos company with their Color Lines and Evgeny Alemzhin's Shariki. So Russia is a motherland of not only one, but 2 famous puzzle games.
This is Unearthed Trail of Ibn Battuta, and it's my pick for Saudi Arabia. This is a game strongly inspired by Naughty Dog's Uncharted series, in which you play as Faris Jawad and his sister as you travel along the Middle East in search of artifacts and knowledge of the famed Muslim explorer Ibn Battuta. And to say that this game was poorly received upon launch would be an understatement, with most of the criticism hinging on how similar the game is to Tomb Raider and Uncharted, something which, I mean, even the game isn't attempting to hide this.
For starters, you were the one who always enjoyed raiding tombs and uncharting mysteries in video games.
The thing is, the game itself is actually not that bad. At its best, it does a decent enough job of feeling like you're raiding ancient tombs and solving puzzles, though it also has cover-based shooting mechanics, which was the style at the time. The problem is that the game tried to do too many things at once and on a shoestring budget. For example, you now have hand-to-hand combat mechanics, something which does not work and the game clearly did not need. And you also have some RC car segments, which feel a little out of place thematically. Perhaps if the developers had spent less time throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the game and focused a bit more on improving animations, maybe the reception wouldn't have been so overly negative. Though I do feel people gave this game a harsher treatment than it truly deserved. In the end, this was a small project that bit off more than it could chew, but was very clearly a labor of love. And you know what? I respect that. My pick for Serbia is a game simply titled Movie. Yes, quite literally a Serbian movie. The jokes just write themselves. And this is a game launched in 1986 for the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC. It's the 1930s in New York and you play as a detective who has to retrieve an audio tape from the mafia. So you go around the various streets and buildings picking up items and weapons, talking to NPCs, and defending yourself from the mob. One thing I find interesting about this game is that it lets you type anything you want when talking to NPCs, which can be hard to trigger the correct keywords to get the response you need, but also creates some funny moments as well. I quite like the adventure aspects of this game, as you often need to bribe people or use the correct keywords and items to get what you want, but the combat on the other hand can be a little slow and stiff, especially when there's multiple enemies on screen. But at least they're just as likely to take themselves out as they are of damaging you. For a 1986 game, this was definitely an ambitious title, and I think it's worth checking out for this reason alone. This is Heretic Kingdoms The Inquisition, and this is my pick for Slovakia. This is a hack-and-slash RPG styled after Diablo, in which you play as a special breed of inquisitors who can use magic and enter the dream world, a parallel universe inhabited by magical beings and wandering spirits. But your character is special because not only can she use magic, but she also has the ability to seal astral rifts, which are basically scars within the dream world. From there on, you have to travel across the various locations you'll unlock via minimap, take on quests and side quests, and level up your character, the latter of which gives you a pretty open system, which lets you dabble into any type of physical or magical skill of your choosing. The downside is that it's also relatively easy to become stuck with a character that is too weak at everything, not helped by this game's punishing difficulty. This is a fun game and I quite like the world design, but it was also very clearly held back by a lower budget, with the game often going into these narration cutscenes, likely because it could only afford one voice actor. Still, if you're into Diablo clones, this is an interesting one to check out. South Africa doesn't seem to have many classic games in its repertoire, but in recent years it has seen a surge in indie games, and the best one of all is, in my opinion, Broforce. A side-scrolling run-and-gun game that is a celebration of classic action movies and TV shows like Rambo, Commando, and RoboCop. So you have to go around the various missions rescuing the various bros, which have the most perfect names ever. And they essentially serve as your life system, with each bro having different weapons and skills at their disposal. And this game is hilarious. The amount of destruction you cause to your enemies and yourself is ludicrous, and you can even use the game's physics to your advantage. Got a group of tough enemies below? Start destroying the ceiling and let it all cave on them. This is a super fun game by yourself, but I can only imagine the chaos it would be in 4-player co-op. So this is a game absolutely worth checking out. South Korea is most likely one of the most underrated gaming countries out there. This is a nation that came out swinging with games that were high quality but often unlicensed due to issues beyond their control, like the Mega Man-inspired Metal Force, or the first proper port of Street Fighter 2 for computers, or an impressive port of Super Mario Bros. For the Sega SG-1000. Over time, they would evolve and develop official games and titles like Mutant DNA for computers, Manic Game Girl for the original PlayStation, the Magna Carta JRPG series, popular MMOs like the Lineage games, strategy games like the brilliantly underrated Kohan series, and of course, the Kingdom Under Fire series. But you know what? My favorite part of South Korean gaming history has always been its bootleg gaming scene, which created high-quality games that simply are not known or do not get the respect they deserve. And this is why I'm picking SWAT Police for South Korea, a 2001 gallery shooter for arcades that is insanely fun to play. The game has tons of weapons, ludicrous destructible environments, and it's just a really fun game to play, as you try to dodge armies of bad guys and robots who all want to take you down. SWAT Police is, in my opinion, as fun to play today as it was the day it came out, and at one point there were even plans to bring the arcade machine to the West, which sadly never materialized. But at least we can now easily play this one on MAME, and I highly recommend it. Moving from one underrated country to another, Spain is filled with bangers that you might not even realize were made there in the first place. We begin, of course, with the Commandos series, a real-time tactics series in which you control a squad of commandos on a slew of missions that became a heavy favorite game for PC gamers around the world. Then, of course, we have Castlevania Lords of Shadows, an attempt at creating a more westernized take on the Castlevania games, which, while somewhat controversial, I truly enjoyed the first game. And that same studio went on to make Metroid Samus Returns for the 3DS and the excellent Metroid Dread for the Nintendo Switch. But no, in order to properly represent Spain, I feel we have to go back to the ZX Spectrum, when Spain was responsible for two of the best looking games on that system. And those games were Game Over, which wowed fans with its large sprites and fun run-and-gun gameplay, and its pseudo-sequel Fantas, which was part shmup and part action-adventure. But Spain's crowning achievement, and my pick for it, is La Abadía del Crimen, or The Abbey of Crime, an adventure game based on the award-winning novel by Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose. It tells the story of a friar and his young apprentice who need to solve a series of murders that took place inside an Italian abbey, and you have to do so while enduring the harsh rules of the abbey and its residents who seem to be hiding its own dark secrets. All the while, they are more concerned that their religious services follow every proper protocol rather than helping you figure out who is behind this series of murders. The game would be brought over to almost every gaming computer of the time, though not every port is official. But if you want the definitive experience of La Abadía del Crimen, then I recommend the modern remake on Steam, which expands dialogue sections, makes the game less cryptic, and is available for free. La Abadía del Crimen was launched during a time when games were more action-focused, and it went against the grain by not having any combat while still giving us a story on a topic that is honestly not very common for gaming even today, and definitely not with this level of maturity. La Abadía del Crimen has always garnered a cult following in Spain, and it shows how much a country's culture can drastically influence a game's design and setting. Sweden is one of the biggest game developers in Europe, and most people probably never even realized this. This is the country responsible for the Battlefield series, Crusader Kings, The Chronicles of Riddick, Amnesia Dark Descent, and of course, Minecraft. So I'm not gonna talk about any of those games. Instead, I'll talk about one of the greatest Sega Genesis/Mega Drive games that should have been launched in 1994, and instead we had to wait until 2019, Ultra Core. This is a run-and-gun game developed by DICE, the same studio responsible for the Battlefield series. And in 1994, they made one of the best run-and-gun games for any 16-bit system. But unfortunately, their publisher at the time time canceled the project, and they were left with a complete game just sitting on their hands. Thankfully, with the advent of modern game releases for retro systems, Ultra Core found new life. And all I can say is that for 25 years, we were robbed of one of the best games of that generation. Ultra Core is a true hidden gem for the system, with great appealing graphics, a superb soundtrack, addicting gameplay, fun weapons, and even some pretty decent cutscenes. Euro game design during this period usually gets a bit of a bad rap, but Ultra Core shows just how well those design elements can coalesce into something greater than the sum of its parts that feels distinctively different from your Contras or Metal Slugs. And so I say, check out this game. It's so worth it. Taiwan is another unsung hero within the gaming world that seems to be a victim of circumstance. This is a country that has proven time and time again that it can produce incredible gaming experiences, but for years sat outside the official distribution networks of established names like Sega or Nintendo, and so it had to resort to bootlegs and unofficial ports, which in turn created some of the best fighting games on the Game Boy Color, official or not, and even an excellent Mega Man X clone. Then of course we have the Poly Game Master, an arcade machine made to compete with the Neo Geo that received dozens of incredible exclusives. But my pick goes to The Legend of Sword and Fairy, a turn-based JRPG style series that took the Chinese market by storm, with a strong focus on Chinese mythology and wuxia style combat. For this video, I'm picking the first game, which was launched for MS-DOS, Windows, and the Sega Saturn. And let me be clear here, this series was to the Chinese markets what Final Fantasy was to the West or Dragon Quest to Japan. This series is still going strong today with 7 main entries, over a dozen spin-offs, novels, and even multiple TV shows. And it all began here, with the first Sword and Fairy game, detailing the story of a young boy raised by his aunt, whose parents are heroes traveling around China on a quest to defeat evildoers. During this time, you hear rumors of a nearby island inhabited by fairies, which is where you come across your future wife, a magic user whom you seem to think is a fairy, but she's actually just a normal human. And together you go on a series of adventures like your parents before you. This is a game with great pixel art, music, and it's easy to see why it resonated so much in its respective markets. And the best part is that there is a translation patch available, so as far as I'm concerned, the time to play this is now. Ukraine is a country that gave birth to the Stalker and the Metro series, both of which are good enough to represent any country. But instead, I want to talk about Chasm: The Rift. This is a first-person shooter strongly inspired by Quake, which launched only a year after its software's seminal shooter, and even managed to predate GoldenEye by a few months. It tells the story of how aliens are creating time rifts across the universe, which at first means you'll fight monsters inside military bases. But once you cross the rift, the levels become a lot more similar to that of Quake, with large medieval castles or industrial complexes filled with monsters. But you also have levels which take place outside, where you fight against goblins while armed with your trusty human weapons. Chasm: The Rift was one of the last hurrahs of the traditional FPS style, which was popularized by Doom and Quake, before the genre would eventually evolve into what we know it as today. And I feel it's worth checking this game out based on that alone.
Hey there guys, DJ Slope from Slope's Game Room with the bloody fantastic opportunity of representing the UK's gaming scene. Where do I even start? So many classic games have come from my end of the world. In fact, it's the reason I started my channel in the first place. For instance, did you know that GoldenEye for the N64 was literally built in a barn on a farmhouse in Leicestershire? cannon fodder and sensible soccer were made in Chelmsford. Lemmings was a massive part of my youth, and that came from Dundee in the east coast of Scotland. And as I got older, Wipeout was pretty much the only game I played in my teen years, thanks to Psygnosis over in Liverpool. The Dizzy franchise originated in a bedroom somewhere in Trowbridge. Little Big Planet began in Guildford. Micro Machines started in Stratford-on-Avon. The majority of Arkham Asylum came from London. Worms continued its development in Wakefield, and even Tomb Raider was developed in Derby. And guys, let me tell you, I really have only scratched the surface here. So what game am I going to show off as the UK's greatest achievement to gaming? Well, the retro enthusiast in me really wants to talk about the sequel to Manic Miner, Jet Set Willy, a game that upon release wasn't even completable, yet was highly praised and has since become a thing of legends. Yep, I'd love to talk about something nice and obscure to the rest of the world like that, but come on, if we're going to be talking about the UK's greatest achievement, how can I not travel back once again to Scotland in 1997, where a small group of lads released the first ever Grand Theft Auto. Starting its development around the tail end of a cancelled Kirby game in 1995, Race and Chase, as it was originally known, eventually became one of the most profitable and well-known game franchises the world has ever seen. Sure, it's a far cry from what the series is known for these days, but that original game and the birth of Liberty City started its life right here. Heck, even the promo for the game was filmed in Dundee too, with members of the team hanging out of car windows, speeding along and getting other team members to keep an eye out for the bobbies. The coppers, the fuzz, the rozzers, the pigs, the old Bill, the police. So, next time you're in a fictional Miami, running over prostitutes so you don't have to pay them, just remember that this whole thing started its life in the same place that orange marmalade was invented. Actually, the marmalade invention argument is up for debate. Still, it's probably best to lead with that instead of the prostitute thing, am I right?
I'm Bob, and my pick to represent the US is Mortal Kombat. It's not just the absolute over-the-top violence and craziness of the game. You also have to remember the era in which this game was released. We were just coming off a time where our president's wife was telling people if you've even seen a plant before that might even resemble something that looks like marijuana, you're probably going to burst into flames and die immediately. This was also a period of time where if you listened to heavy metal, that definitely meant that you were a Satanist who slowly killed animals. So when that was coming on the scene, we were also having one senator from the state that I lived in at the time telling people that video games were causing the problems of every single human being that's ever lived on the earth. And when this game came out, it was the most giant and egregious middle finger ever held up to everyone who's ever said crap like that. And also, it's absolutely hilarious. All kidding aside, I gotta be honest, I hate real violence. I hate, like, torture scenes in movies, but cartoonish violence is hilarious to me. Wile E. Coyote getting hit with an anvil is funny. An actual human getting hit with an anvil would make me want to throw up, and I would never be able to unsee that. And Mortal Kombat, at least the original one for me, embodies all of the cartoon violence any kid of that era would have ever wanted. The very first time I saw Sub-Zero grab somebody's head and rip head and spinal cord out at the same time, I could not stop laughing. And to this day, if I haven't played the game in a while and I do that fatality, which is a forward down forward high punch, if I remember correctly from all those years ago, I still laugh because it's just so funny. And of course, they borrowed heavily from Enter the Dragon, and Liu Kang definitely totally wasn't Bruce Lee, but it's not that. It's not that the Mortal Kombat was the most original game or even the best fighting game ever. It's just that for that period in time, it really represents kind of the feel of being a kid with all of that unbelievable repression coming around. And it was one of the, at least for me, I mean, don't forget, the US is geographically gigantic. It's like the size of all of Europe, and there's 350 million people who live here. So my experience definitely reflects the city that I lived in or right outside of. It reflects the people around me, and by no means is this a representation of all of America from that time, but I absolutely could speak to my own experiences, and it definitely reflects those. And having that game come out and having it essentially be the final nail in the coffin for requiring ratings for video games was such an iconic thing, and I truly think the game holds up. Yeah, there are some tweaks that could be made to make it a little more fair, which the Mortal Kombat Plus team absolutely nailed for anybody that likes emulation and wouldn't mind hacking into the ROMs. But it's a fun game, it's an awesome fighting game. Might not be as good as Street Fighter, but the impact that it had and how it completely changed video games and the rating system, I think is why it's a great representation of that era.
This is Fightin' Rage, a beat-em-up launched in 2017 for PCs and modern consoles. And man, is this game super fun! This is a clear love letter to old beat-em-ups like Final Fight and Streets of Rage, and it absolutely gets everything right, making it my pick for Uruguay. The physics and combo system are top-notch, making it fun and easy to juggle enemies. The graphics are also excellent, and the music even more so. And man, just look at these sick combos, filled with flourishes and zoom-ins. And any newcomer can pull 50-hit combos with ease. And I also really like how many enemies you'll have to face off against at the same time. Crowd control is definitely a major part of Fightin' Rage. You also have a slew of weapons to pick up and a wide assortment of moves that you can pull off at any time. Heck, I often end up using a ton of fancy moves that I have no idea how I actually pull them off. The game also has a story, but you can just skip over it. I mean, it's a nice thing to have, but it's not really necessary. So yeah, if you're into 2D beat-em-ups, then Fightin' Rage is absolutely a game you should look out for. This is Valhalla Cyberpunk Bartender Action, an indie darling released in 2016 and my pick for Venezuela. This is the game that inspired Indonesia's Coffee Talk, and it's easy to see why someone would become inspired to make a game after playing this. You are a bartender in a futuristic cyberpunk world, and it's your job to serve people's drinks and listen to their stories as you learn more about this world. The HUD, aesthetic and soundtrack are very clearly inspired off of Hideo Kojima's Snatcher, right down to the subtitle, which is very obviously parodying another Kojima property, Metal Gear Solid. What's interesting here is that Valhalla originally began as a Game Jam title, but the developer, Sukeban Games, enjoyed their project so much that they made it into a full game, and you can actually still download the original game for free if you're so inclined. Throughout the game, you have to serve customers the right drink and earn money, and you have to make a minimum amount of money every few days, with the excess going into bonus items. And just like the game it inspired, Coffee Talk, Valhalla discusses some pretty heavy themes, though always under the veil of a dystopic cyberpunk world. And in that regard, I feel Valhalla is a bit more subtle in its themes, even if they often discuss more adult topics, if you get my drift. Whereas Coffee Talk, despite having fantasy creatures like people from Seattle, tended to be a bit more grounded but also more heavy-handed in its approach. But regardless, Valhalla is exactly the sort of game that led me to create this video. We have a country that is typically not known for developing video games, and an indie project that began as a free Game Jam title. And the end result is a uniquely beautiful and beautifully written experience that went on to achieve wide success, proving that great ideas and great execution can truly come from anywhere. We often just need a little help and a little push. Speaking of massive successes coming from unlikely places, we have the country of Vietnam, where the mobile game Free Fire stems from. A game which only 2 years ago peaked with 150 million active daily users. Just to give you an idea, that is more than Counter-Strike, Dota, PUBG, Apex Legends and Roblox combined. But despite its success, Free Fire is not my pick for Vietnam. Instead, I want a simpler game, a small game, that just like Venezuela, proves that success is a lightning in a bottle that can come from anywhere. Yes, Flappy Bird, a simple game that came out of nowhere and took the world by storm. It's hard to overstate just how the world went insane over this little title, generating over $50,000 a day in free adverts alone. And all because some YouTubers decided to cover this game out of nowhere. Yes, sometimes success is as random as it is fickle. But unfortunately, Flappy Bird is also a cautionary tale of what happens when success comes at you fast, as the creator suddenly began receiving a barrage of interview requests, insults, and even threats. In the end, the creator caved under the pressure and removed his game. But regardless, Flappy Bird became a case study for mobile game developers, one that, in my opinion, unwittingly changed how mobile games are created and marketed. Between Free Fire and Flappy Bird, it seems that Vietnam has a penchant for creating widely successful mobile games. And there we have it. This is the end of part 1 of this video. I feel 40 games and countries is a good stopping point. And hey, if this video does well, we'll see a part 2. In the meantime, I'd like to thank all the content creators who represented their countries for this video, as well as my newest Patreon supporters, Benui Yui and JB. Thank you for helping make the channel better. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!